Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. I'm Sarah Rosen-Wortel with the great privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute and thanking all of you who are joining us from around the country. We had almost 1,200 RSVPs, I've been corrected, despite it being the hot days of August recess. And it shows just how committed housers around the country are really looking for ideas and progress. So it gives me a special pleasure to welcome all of you to the Urban Institute, albeit virtually, because I know this work matters to you as it does to us. First, let me do a few housekeeping items. The event is being recorded, and the recording and the relevant links will be posted online after the event. If you go back to the event page, you can find it there. Live captions are turned on, and if you find that disruptive to you, you can turn them off by visiting the live transcript icon on the bottom of your screen. As a participant, everyone is muted, so please type your questions or comments into the questions box at any time. We will be also sending you a link to a post-event survey, and if you have the moment, please share your feedback with us. It's helpful to us and the panelists to hear what you're thinking about, and it'll shape the work we take on in the future. And finally, it's great if we all join the conversation online. Use the hashtag #PleaseLiveAtUrban, and then we can all be in one conversation together. So with logistics behind us, I want to thank you for joining us for this conversation, where we're going to be looking at how closing the homeownership gap will contribute not only to closing the country's racial wealth gap, but also to help us address the housing affordability crisis that we have in so many communities across the country. Now, I've been working in housing for 30 years, and yet the severity of today's challenge is greater than I've ever seen. Obviously, we have a pandemic that has disconnected many from work and income and made overcrowded housing an even greater health danger. And now with an eviction moratorium slated to end in October and still many states and localities struggling to distribute federal rental assistance funds and the Delta variant surging, we are not out of the woods by a long shot. At the same time, house prices and rents are rising in so many markets, making what were unsustainable affordability gaps for low-mod families even greater. In addition, this past year has cast a new light on housing instability and racial disparities in all facets of our society, none more so than housing. And while the light was new, the disparities were not. For BIPOC communities, the disproportionate burdens trace back generations, whether through redlining by government actors, discriminatory lending practices throughout the mortgage market, or the segregation and exclusionary zoning that persists today. This country's housing policies and practice have harmed BIPOC households and robbed communities of color, not only of housing stability, but also of the most fundamental foundational mechanisms for wealth accumulation, economic mobility, and pathways to a better future for their children. It's really important that we name the long history of these harms and the actors that perpetrated them so that we're better able to recognize the long shadow of structural racism when we see it reflected in today's conditions. It also helps us to recognize the scale of bold action that will be needed to remedy these harms and ensure that equitable outcomes, housing stability, and access to wealth building opportunities are created for Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities, as it is for so many others. If I were writing on a blank slate, and I'm a houser, I still would not argue that a volatile asset like a home should be the best mechanism for savings that we have. But I'm not writing on a blank slate. The fact is, homeownership is the biggest creator of wealth in our society, more than income or access to higher education. And the Black-white homeownership gap is larger than it was in 1968, when discrimination in housing was first made illegal. Inequitable access to homeownership perpetuates wealth inequality and denies people the opportunities for business, education, retirement security, etc., that wealth can bring to a family. What we less often think about, however, is that in many markets, access to homeownership is also a pathway to more affordable housing, especially for communities of color and families with lower incomes. Because in many places, the monthly cost of a mortgage may be less than rent. Now, not everyone is ready to own, but for those who are, the barriers to that mortgage are large and actually leave them spending too much of their income for housing. So today our conversation is going to explore the data and research of when and how homeownership can be more affordable than renting, when it is and when it isn't, and how to increase access to homeownership, especially for BIPOC households, in places where it would be advantageous. At Urban, our job is to help policymakers and practitioners at every level, federal, state, local, and even neighborhood, make better choices, arming them with data, evidence, and facts. And that's what I hope our great group of guests today will do as well. We're going to have Mike Lofton, who is CEO of HomeWise and also a non-resident fellow at Urban, start off by giving us a brief presentation of some of the facts and grounding of this conversation. And then he'll join in dialogue with Noel Poyo, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community Economic Development at Treasury and a longstanding partner, former CEO of NALCAP. We have Lisa Mensah, President and CEO of the Opportunity Finance Network, a network of our nation's CDFIs and long participant in these issues. And finally, Urban Institute's own Monique King-Veland, who is Associate Vice President of Urban's Metropolitan Communities and Housing Center, and formerly the Executive Director of the Los Angeles County Development Authority. So she's done this work on the ground as well. And at the end of the event, we're really honored that we'll be hearing a recorded message from Senator Sherrod Brown. I'd like to thank our friends at HomeWise for their support that helped us to put this event together. And now let me turn it over to Mike, who will provide the foundation and start the conversation going. Really glad you could all be here. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. Today we have a very exciting panel, a very robust, that I think is going to follow up with a very robust discussion of, just looking for my notes here. I don't know where they went. Excuse me 1 second. Okay, there it is. So the panel is going to focus on how America can increase access to homeownership. This is important for 2 reasons. Closing the homeownership gap is central to closing the wealth gap. It is also key to increasing the long-term affordability of housing for American families. This latter point is generally overlooked in policy discussions regarding how to increase housing affordability. I'm going to spend a few minutes exploring why and how homeownership is such a powerful strategy in increasing housing affordability, and then we'll open up the conversation with our panelists. Homeownership is affordable housing. According to data from data analytics, a home is cheaper than renting a comparable home in 2/3 of American counties. This is true the date of the purchase. But even if a buyer does initially pay more to purchase a home, over time, the home becomes more affordable. On average, homeowners pay less of their income on housing than do renters, 10 percentage points less. Of course, this is true, you might say, because homeowners tend to have higher incomes than renters. Next slide. But if you control for income, it's still true. Low-income renters with incomes below $50,000 pay 34% of their income on housing, while owners pay only 24%. Very low-income renters with incomes less than $20,000 pay 48%, almost half of their income, and owners pay 38%. This is 10 percentage points less. This is not 10% less. So for example, if you take a household with an income of $40,000, that renter would typically pay $1,133 a month. And the typical homeowner would pay only $800. This is a difference of $333 each and every month. Next slide. This is also true across race and ethnicity. While white owners pay less of their income on housing than do Black and Latino homeowners, Black and Latino homeowners pay less than all renters, including white renters. Next slide. More low-income renters are considered cost burden than low-income homeowners. 75% of low-income renters are considered cost burden versus 49% of owners. And a whopping 42% of low-income renters are considered severely cost burdened, compared to only 26% of homeowners. This pattern is also true for very low-income households. Next slide. We tend to see cost burden in a binary way. You are either burdened or you're not burdened. In my paper, Homeownership is Affordable Housing, I tried to break this down further. Who is doing really well in terms of their housing expense? Who pays very little of their income on housing? What I found is 31% of low-income owners pay less than 20% of their income on housing expense. This is only true for 7% of low-income renters. Next slide. So why is homeownership cheaper than renting? Mostly it's because the biggest portion of a homeowner's housing expense, principal and interest, is held constant, while 100% of rent is subject to inflation. The only portion of the homeowner's expense subject to inflation is taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs. Next slide. Because the majority of a homeowner's housing expense is held constant, over time, their housing expense ratio also declines. Typically, their income rises at a higher rate than does their housing expense. This is not true for the renter. Next slide. So how we generally think about a homeowner's housing expense, this is something important. We typically include in the owner's housing expense, principal, interest, taxes, insurance, and in my paper, I include maintenance expenses. But one of these is actually not an expense at all. The owner's principal payment is really not an expense. The principal payment behaves like an automatic savings account. It's not money going out, it's money staying in. The homeowner gets to keep it. For this reason, the homeowner's housing expense actually declines in absolute terms, not just relative to renting. Next slide. There's something else missing in the previous slide that compared the homeowner's housing expense to the renter's over time. It left out payment 361, the payment after the mortgage has been paid off. I call this the homeownership affordability big bang. When the 30-year mortgage has been paid off, the homeowner's payment drops to only the cost of taxes and insurance. This dramatic drop in housing costs often coincides with when people start retiring, when incomes typically decline. This is another reason why homeownership is affordable housing. I hope this helps explain the power of homeownership in increasing long-term housing affordability and why it is so important to increase access to homeownership for people of color and lower income households who have been left behind by the current system. Too often policy debates treat addressing the wealth gap through homeownership and addressing housing affordability as oppositional goals. I think they are completely compatible goals. We can do both. So now let's turn to the discussion to how we can increase access to homeownership. So I'd like to welcome our panelists, Monique King-Zeeland, Lisa Mensa, and Noel Pollitt. Welcome, everybody. So let's begin with, I just talked about how homeownership can help close the wealth gap and the affordability gap. And that these goals are not oppositional, but they're complementary. But when we talk about housing affordability, oftentimes affordable housing and rental housing are conflated, and we only talk about rental housing when we start talking about affordable housing. Why do you think this is true? Why isn't increasing access to affordable or homeownership a bigger part of our nation's effort to increase housing affordability? Lisa, would you like to?
I'll kick us off, Mike. Yeah. I love the question, and I want to congratulate you on your paper. I think you're making a huge contribution by just putting this frame in front of us. I think homeownership must be part of the conversation for affordability, but also for closing the wealth gap, which is such a big priority. Right now, it is really one of the priorities of this administration, and we are all talking about it more. And I think we have this bias in our heads that says it's out of reach. And what your paper did is reveal more of the country and more of the opportunity. And I think for community development financial institutions, CDFIs, that have been in this fight for more affordable homeownership, we stand ready to help change this dialogue and to help bring the goal of homeownership closer to more Americans. So I'm thrilled you're putting it out there. I think we are piercing through a debate that has often seen homeownership as unaffordable. And I'm very glad to be here because I think we've got a case to make, and your work at HomeWise has proved this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say that it's worth remembering that homeownership is also this myth, this aspiration, this American dream thing, right? And that's great. Sometimes as a spectacular motivator. It can also have a double edge to it. Also can be a challenge. And so I think that, you know, in the run up to the Great Recession, there was a great deal of using that myth of homeownership to really tempt people into the kinds of mortgages that weren't what you would want to see, and with implications after the crisis fell. And I think then in response to that, particularly in many communities that I've worked in, there was a sort of a suspicion of homeownership and the mortgage, and you know, is that really wealth building? Is that really going to work out? And you run the numbers, and you've done it again, Mike, and said, yep, sure is, right? But when we get to this question, sort of where is that gap between the public debate and policy and some of this data that you're laying out, I think some of it gets wrapped up in that sort of that emotion and that myth that exists, and pulling it apart, I think, does us a great service to understand where are the pitfalls for sure, but also how can we not walk by these opportunities that really strengthen communities? Monique, I'll toss to you.
Yeah, I think the other part of the issue or the tension is that there is an incredible amount of concern, pressure, advocacy, and focus, like rightfully so, around housing our unhoused neighbors right now across the country, and also battling rising housing instability. We all know the numbers about the number of people, something like 580,000 who are experiencing homelessness on our streets on any given night. And Mike, you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but even pre-COVID, we also know that nearly 11 million renter households were struggling, right? Paying more than half of their incomes towards rent. It's probably also worth noting that before the pandemic, we had an average of 2 million evictions that were being filed each year across the US, right? So even pre-COVID, and now frankly, probably more so, people are rightfully concerned, right, with sort of an immediacy around affordable housing solutions that they feel have lower barriers to entry, like rental housing. But I think, Mike, your point is really important, right? Homeownership can play a role both in closing the wealth gap and in increasing housing affordability and maybe even stability, and that the goals are not oppositional or mutually exclusive. And at some point, we have to look at parallel approaches that recognize both the urgency of the current state of affairs, but also the need to leverage multiple tools to really address a complex set of problems.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's really helpful. It's an interesting subject. So there are some, albeit limited, federal support for homeownership programs. They're typically carried out by state and local governments and their nonprofit partners. For example, HUD's home and CDBG programs can be used for down payment assistance, but this use is not very common. Monique, you have had a lot of experience with these programs. What's your assessment of how they are being used or could be used to increase access to homeownership? And why aren't they being used more?
So, when I was with the city of Trenton, we administered both CDBG and home programs. And during my time in Los Angeles County, we administered home, ESG, almost the full alphabet soup, if you will. And we were the largest urban county CDBG program in the country. And CDBG can fund nearly 30, right, eligible activities that include everything from infrastructure to economic development projects to homeownership, rehabilitation, for example, in low to moderate income communities. And like CDBG, Home provides also is a formula-based program that provides a similar focus, but with Home, the activities are really focused around building, buying, or rehabilitating affordable housing for rent or homeownership. In fact, Home is the largest federal block grant to state and local governments designed exclusively to create affordable housing for low-income households. In my experience, both CDBG and Home are heavily used programs, right? But CDBG is typically used to fund more what I'll say are bricks and mortar type projects. Like, so for example, historically, CDBG grantees typically expend 1/3 of their funds on public facilities and improvement projects. So think roads, landscapes, streetscapes, those type of things. When I was in LA County, we did expend 32% of our CDBG funds on housing related activities. But again, even those housing related activities were more bricks and mortar, right? And during the same time frame, we committed more than 50% of our home funds to homeownership activities specifically, including both rehabilitation and down payment assistance for low income buyers. I think though truer for home than CDBG, jurisdictions can and are using the activities for housing and homeownership, but not the majority of their funds, honestly, and not always in the ways that we would like down payment assistance. I think the challenges are complex and varied with leveraging the funds in the manners necessary to sort of scale up significant homeownership efforts, including, again, the immediacy issues of homelessness and housing instability that feel like there's sort of battle and tension between those issues, the political pressures to focus on and scale up lower barrier solutions, the scale of the impact of rental versus homeowners. So I may fund a project that when it's done, will have 200 units for permanent supportive housing, or I may fund a project that may have 50 homeowners going. So just the numbers, right? The widgets sometimes from a public perspective can be a little challenging. And then I think the other issue that's very real are sort of market pressures, particularly in high cost markets like the West Coast, right? So even pre-COVID, it was challenging for practitioners like I used to be in jurisdictions to make convincing arguments for funding homeownership when we're also being questioned about rising numbers of our unhoused neighbors on the streets and rising eviction rates in the jurisdictions. So finding and getting support for that right balance is tough, though I think it's necessary, and these programs can be very effective.
I had a follow-up question for you on that. You know, at the beginning of Home, about 2/3 of the money, a little over 2/3 of the money was used for home ownership programs. HUD changed the regs on the home for home ownership in 2013, and since that time, it's gone down to less of 1/3 of the money from home is being used for home ownership. Do you think the change in the regs might have had something to do with the you know, what they call participating jurisdictions deciding not to use home money anymore for home ownership?
I mean, I think it was a combination of things. We have to think about the regulatory changes. There was some really difficult audit findings around home in some jurisdictions across the country in a near time frame. And I think we also have to remember home funding was reduced significantly over that time frame, right? So you also had less home funds coming into communities. We are just seeing in the last several years more uptick in home than we've seen in a very long time, right? So I think all of those things require jurisdictions to make some very tough choices about how their resources are going to be spent across the different government programs.
Right. Okay, thanks. So another question I have is, like, you know, CDFIs have become a very important source of financing for people, for businesses, for nonprofits, and others who've not been served well by traditional financial institutions. For instance, when there was recognition that many communities were, you know, in effect, food deserts and lacked access to healthy foods, CDFIs and the CDFI Fund stepped up to that challenge, and now dozens of CDFIs are financing grocery stores across the country. More recently, CDFIs stepped up to help small businesses access PPP loans when those businesses couldn't get help through the bigger banks. Lisa, do you think CDFIs could play a similar role in increasing access to home ownership, especially for those populations and communities that have been left behind by traditional lenders?
Thanks, Mike. I really do think there is a bigger role for CDFIs here. Monique used the word leverage. I think CDFIs have been the kind of on-the-ground institutions that know how to leverage these complicated sources. I think we have several things as a field. You know, there are over 1,000 certified CDFIs, 350 of them are members of OFN, our network. And what we have going for us is that we are on the ground. We know our local markets. we are on your side. We are the kind of financial institutions that can do fair and responsible products. The kind of thing that Noelle mentioned that was one of the sad legacies from the last housing crisis was that all the mortgages weren't fair. And yet CDFI mortgages are fair, and their work with clients can be absolutely fair. And then finally, we're motivated to close this wealth gap. What we learned from the PPP experience that you mentioned is that your lender matters. It matters who's motivated to make this loan. And CDFI stepped up in ways that were surprising to all of us. You know, by the time we were authorized to participate in the rounds, $30 billion of PPP loans were made through CDFI. So I think there's a huge opportunity. I think we already have examples. You know, when I testified to Sherrod Brown's committee, we talked about small dollar mortgages. These are the kind of products that you've done at HomeWise and that the Fahy network has done in Appalachia. It's the kind of products that are done in Brownsville, Texas by, you know, Come Build, Come Dream. It's the kind of products in Louisiana that the Southern Mutual Help Association has done. And it's the kind of products that are done in native lands, for bands. So I think there is a real strong groundwork to build on with CDFIs. Our challenge is getting the right kind of capital in so that we can do this work and do it at larger scale. But I absolutely think we are positioned as a field to help strengthen the homeownership movement to low-income households and join you, Mike, as you've called out in this affordability challenge.
Noelle, do you have thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, so, you know, Monique mentioned, said a lot about some of the traditional sources and mentioned some new ones that are coming. And I think CDFIs are, for many, sort of a new part of this conversation. And so I think we can actually look forward to this space having a lot of new in it, a lot of innovation in it. And part of that is driven by a set of investments that this administration has sort of doubled down on, right? And so if you look at what we're able to do with the Treasury Department, certainly the Capital Magnet Fund at the CDFI Fund has been a source that can be used for homeownership. And actually, we have another round of the Capital Magnet Fund coming up, but not too far in the future. You know, the state and local fiscal recovery fund, remember, $350 billion. This is an enormous amount of money, which can be used flexibly for quite a few things. But we hear from the field how mayors and governors are thinking about affordable housing as a top priority and thinking both about rental and homeownership. And that's not a source, I think, that's been sort of on the tip of people's tongues when they talk about housing, but indeed there's a wide range of eligible uses, including related to affordable housing. And also worth remembering the Emergency Capital Investment Program, a major new investment that will flow through depository CDFIs. And so these are, you know, regulated banks and credit unions that many of which are engaged in mortgage, and many of which will have an unprecedented opportunity to grow their balance sheets and step into new spaces. And we expect that some will indeed be in the mortgage space. But I think, you know, looking at this sort of extraordinary explosion that we've seen in the CDFI sector, at my seat at the Treasury Department, I'm honored and privileged to be able to lead the team around a variety of CDFI issues. We have the CDFI Fund, the Emergency Capital Investment Program, which flows through CDFIs and MDIs. And I think we can look forward to sort of a period of sort of renaissance of innovation, and that all comes with the availability of capital. As Lisa said, this comes back to having not just access to capital, but the right kind of capital to build fair and responsible products, right? And fair and responsible products. I can't underline enough how important it is that we have business models that are built around delivering fair and responsible products. And that's exactly what CDFIs do. So in any case, I think looking forward to seeing how we build in this space, because I think it will be a once in a lifetime opportunity here in the coming years to do so.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because you mentioned, I have to admit, a couple of things I didn't even know about that's coming out of Treasury, and you also mentioned the Capital Magnet Fund, which I am familiar with. You know, there's a lot of stuff at the CDFI fund, like Capital Magnet, the Bond Guarantee Program, the Financial Assistance Award, New Market Tax Credits, all of which can be used for home ownership. Do you have thoughts about how those other kinds of things could be utilized?
I think what we have is a real track record of innovative uses in a number of these programs, which have the potential for greater impact. Right. And so I won't get ahead of ourselves. The CDFI fund is working hard. It's an extraordinary team. They put the rapid response program dollars on the street that I think made a difference for across the CDFI field. We're really pleased to see Lisa there with the Vice President of the United States and the Treasury Secretary announcing that here not so very long ago. But I think that there are opportunities to build on in some of those programs. And so we look forward to sort of input from the field about how to build on that. And I think there is some ongoing sort of communication input to take in order to build on those opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I joined that presentation, Lisa, that you did with the Vice President with the rapid response stuff. That was just awesome. That was such an exciting day. Everybody did a great job. And so I have the same question for you, Lisa. It's like there's all these different, what you're very familiar with, all these different kinds of things that the CDFI fund does that aren't necessarily household names, like the bond guarantee and Capital Magnet, New Market Tax Credits, the Financial Assistance Awards. What are your thoughts on how some of those might be utilized to increase access to home ownership?
Yeah, thanks. I think acronyms never really roll off the tongue. I get them confused half the time, but I'm impressed with Monique's ability to go quick. The important thing is that we need our government to be the big partner here. They've always been the partner, you know, in moving the private sector. And I think the CDFI fund has a lot of potential. The government programs like Capital Magnet Fund, like the Bond Guarantee Fund, these can be powerful. Mike, you've had experience. They're not always easy to work with. It's not always easy to partner with government. So we're going to keep working with Noel and his colleagues to get as much friction out of the programs. But yes, they can be partners. I like to think of the challenge as both expanding existing programs, making them work better, and then pushing ahead with programs that need to know the CDFI partners and need to make room for us. You know, there is future work to do. It's not all here, but I do think there is room for expansion. I experienced that at the Department of Agriculture. People don't know that the Department of Agriculture has tremendous housing programs, and we need the right partners to expand this. We also need the political capital to just invest in housing and to make more of those dollars flow. So I think you're right to keep your eyes on Treasury, on these new programs that have come, that are in the shop that Noel controls. That will be important. It is important long-term capital that can be converted to the way CDFIs move mortgages and move financing to create homeownership opportunities, but more is possible. So I say expand some of the existing programs, but also let's open up some new doors so that the trusted partners who care about closing this wealth gap and doing it, as Noel said, in a fair and responsible way so that we can actually do this. I am so often moved by the competence of a bunch of very small CDFIs who know how to help low-income homeowners get into a home, stay in it, and build wealth. And it's just sad that they haven't had enough to work with. So I am thankful for this moment. I'm thankful, you know, that the administration, it was actually the last administration that passed the money. It's this administration that is carrying it forward, doubling down. So it is bipartisan and it needs to be serious. So.
Well, that's great. So speaking of new things, I think you all know that both houses of Congress are considering a reconciliation bill that would provide billions of dollars of new funding for housing. Both the House and the Senate discussions are are talking about provisions to create a dedicated down payment assistance program. So the first question I have for maybe for Monique is, what do you think of this idea of having this national down payment assistance program? How would you make sure the program reaches the communities that have been left behind in our current system, and maybe left behind by some of like the block grant programs and stuff you talked about earlier? So share your thoughts on what these proposals for a national down payment assistance program.
That's a big question. Honestly, I am equal parts hopeful and hesitant about the ongoing discussions. You know, as Sarah touched on in her opening remarks, right? Racial disparities in homeownership and housing wealth are a result of current demographic differences and are a byproduct of past discriminatory housing policies and deliberate actions by multiple market players, including the federal government. You know, the era of explicit discrimination in the housing market, implicit discrimination that continued even after the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, the tight credit market today that makes it hard for families of color to access the mortgage markets, and the lack of affordable housing supply, which we've talked about, right? Which makes it even harder for families of color to buy homes and build wealth. You know, the Black ownership rate at the end of 2020 was 44.1%, compared with 74.5% of white Americans. And as Sarah noted, right, though it's worth repeating, the gap in the homeownership rates between Black and white Americans today is even higher than it was in 1960 when racial discrimination in housing was legal. And homeownership plays a bigger role in creating wealth for Black families than it does for white families. So for me, this is not just an issue of increasing homeownership, but an issue of increasing Black, Indigenous, people of color homeownership and reducing the wealth gap. So I think additional resources are great. I think those resources need to be targeted towards communities like BIPOC communities that have been left out, with the goal of increasing BIPOC homeownership and reducing the wealth gap. And I think there are a couple things to consider that are important. We need to be enhancing targeted outreach in these communities. Lisa touched on this by enlisting trusted community-based organizations, culturally competent and culturally specific organizations as partners in the outreach process. I think we have to be thinking about creating new programs and approaches to mortgage financing that address the disparities in access to credit and the reliance on credit scores as a key factor in underwriting. I think pairing tools like down payment assistance with housing counseling to ensure that we're adequately preparing BIPOC families for homeownership and keeping them in their homes is equally important. And finally, I think we have to ensure that the playing field is at least more level, which means enforcing fair housing and fair lending laws as well. I think funding coupled with those types of policy recommendations would give me hope.
Lisa, do you have thoughts about a national down payment assistance program?
Well, I worked for much of my life on savings for life. And I think that one barrier to the homeownership challenge has always been people don't have enough savings to get into the house. So down payment assistance supports that. And so, yes, I think it's a bold step in the right direction. And I'm so pleased that Chair Waters is championing this. She knows what the block has been. It is the route to the first nest egg of equity in a house. However, again, it matters who you're partnered with. And this is, again, why these trusted partners matter. You know, in Indianapolis, one of our members, INHP, worked on an old IDA program, Individual Development Account Program. But that was the trusted way to build a down payment, to work with people while they were in rental housing, to match their savings, and then put them in a great home with a great more affordable mortgage. And we're talking about single mothers making $30,000 who could responsibly own in Indianapolis. And so I think total step in the right direction. Down payment has been the block. But again, it would be great if those programs accelerated trusted partners so that we could help get the targets that Monique has mentioned. We've got this huge wealth gap. And like it or not, this is America's answer to the wealth gap. Most Americans do build their most significant nest egg in a home. And with the I loved your chart, Mike, of the 31 year, where you could recoup some of your income, and, have a nest egg at the end of this. So I'm full-throatedly pleased and supportive of down payment assistance. I think it works best when you can also move it close to a trusted partner who will get families into those, or single moms or single dads into the kind of homes that we know could be affordable and take a dent in this big challenge that we have.
Monique, you mentioned that the importance of we also have a housing supply problem in parts of the country. And one concern about a national down payment assistance program that has been expressed out there by increasing demand for homes may not be, it's a problem where you also have a shortage of supply. You just contribute to rising costs of homes. Advocates for down payment assistance would counter that if you increase the supply, but you don't level the playing field for those who lack the financial resources to buy a home, resources that often come from parents, they will still be left behind. What is your take on this debate? And are we turning a fundamentally both-and situation into a false either-or choice?
It's funny. I think these days in particular, conversations like these tend to lend themselves to very either or debates, right? It's this or it's this. So yes, I think it's the short answer, right, to your question, Mike. I mean, from my perspective, both positions are valid, right? Demand for affordable housing is outpacing supply, and even more problematic, right? It has outpaced supply for quite some time, which is why we're so behind. And which is why we have such a deficit of affordable housing units. Affordable housing supply is an issue, period, right? But what's also true is just increasing supply will not level the playing field, especially as it relates to building wealth for Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities, period. So I would end, I think, Mike, with where we began, right? Homeownership can play a role in both closing the wealth gap and increasing housing affordability, albeit this is going to be more realistic in some markets than it's going to be in others. And these goals are not mutually exclusive. And at some point, we have to look at parallel approaches. The fact is, we have an urgent situation from a housing affordability perspective, from a homeownership perspective, and we need to leverage multiple tools in the toolbox.
That's good. Noel or Lisa, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, if I may, I just, I think that Monique and Lisa have both framed the challenge accurately and provided a beautiful solution. And I wanna underscore what the stakes here are, right? I think sometimes when we talk about these things, folks mistakenly hear that we're talking about those people. We're talking about somebody else, right? And what we're talking about here is our economy, right? Is the competitiveness of our country moving forward, right? And so this discussion has been based in a discussion of market opportunity, the interplay between supply and demand. And oftentimes what I think the value of these investments, particularly investments through CDFIs and other trusted partners like that, is absolutely for the tremendous impact they produce, but also for the ways in which they lead the private market. Much larger amounts of capital follow them to realize they see the data, they see the outcomes and say, oh wow, we were walking by a market opportunity. And to be clear, if we do not change the homeownership gap in this country, if we do not change the wealth gap, it's not hard to do the math. Our demographics are not going to change on a dime, right? Look at the census data and who makes up our country in 20 years, in 40 years, in 60 years, and calculate those wealth gaps and move them forward. You are losing GDP. You are losing global competitiveness. You are losing the place of America in this world, right? And so this is not about those people, whoever those might be to someone, right? This is about strengthening this economy from the ground up, the people who built this country, and making sure that we're competitive moving forward. And I think sometimes that sort of macro view about the implications of these microtransactions is sometimes not fully appreciated. And as such, it's the importance to what Monique and Lisa are framing up so well, I think, just in my view, doesn't get its due sufficiently.
That's good.
Mike, I loved that response. I just have to say that the market argument that Noel is making is so powerful macro, but he's also sitting in a seat where he has helped us move a market. We have done this before. We have used government resources. Part of what you accomplish, Mike, or what our members like CDBC or the Affordable Homes of South Texas do, they will produce supply in a way that is not where the market is. And I love Noel's shout out that others follow, but it's also true that sometimes the market produces for a higher end customer. And what we're using government resources for as CDFIs is to innovate in the end of the market, which is not as, it doesn't make as much money for folks. And so, but we know there is supply and we know there is demand and what I'm so proud of our CDFIs is, we take these government subsidies and convert them into markets that we know have value and can repay a mortgage over the 30 years. And oftentimes our CDFIs have had to own a lot of the supply chain along a thing so that something could be built. And just a shout out, we're not building in the old ways. We're building in a much greener net zero approach now when we have a chance to intervene in these markets. So I think I'm just so glad to be at the level of, this isn't just a little thing about those people. I love Noel's point. We are really doing something that this economy needs in a big way for our competitiveness and frankly, our greener future.
Let's turn to some questions from the audience real quickly here. The one question we got was, what are new and creative ways to fund the cost of rehab or rehabilitation in majority Black neighborhoods when sometimes it exceeds the cost of the rehab exceeds the post-appraised value. We have community members ready to take the leap to home ownership, but the cost of rehab prevents home ownership in neighborhoods in which they currently live. So this is an issue which people often call the value gap, that once you rehab a home, the total costs of that home now exceed what that home's going to appraise at. Monique, do you have thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, it's interesting. I suspect Lisa probably has thoughts more on the financing side and some of the more innovative models that you would need to financing. I think what struck me in the question that I think is important is the value gap in the appraisal issue. My colleagues at Urban have done a lot of research around this issue of appraisal gap and how homes in predominantly Black, Indigenous, Latinx communities are undervalued from an appraisal perspective. And I think there definitely, along with these other conversations around homeownership, need to be conversations about how we address the disparities in appraisal values of homes in communities. Because it's one thing to say that you're going to increase homeownership in these communities to build wealth, but if folks aren't getting the wealth, because their homes are being underappraised, we have an additional problem. And so I think there's an opportunity to really think about how there are other avenues that need to be parallel along this path. And one of those is addressing the disparities in appraisals in communities of color. And how are we educating appraisers? How are we making sure that we're figuring out that there are gaps and doing pair testing and other things to make sure that that's getting pointed out from a fair housing and fair lending perspective. And then also, how are we looking at other models like, for instance, computerized appraisals and other things to help bring a level of parity to make sure that people are getting the value they need before we even think about financing the rehabilitation.
There is something else to be paying attention out there that helps address this issue. I think this appraisal issue is a huge issue. And I know Urban Institute has done very good research on this. The other thing to pay attention to is this new legislation called the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act that is designed to address this problem, right? So in disinvested neighborhoods where you're not getting appraised value of homes, that there would be some resources to be able to improve homes and still sell them at affordable housing and cover that appraisal gap. So I think different people are attacking this problem from different points of view. I don't know if Lisa, if you have anything to add to that.
On the last point, Mike, I don't have anything specifically, but I think whenever we're talking about the sale, the moment of sale, of resale, I think Monique is making a great point about what is the appraised value. I know that our CDFIs have spent so much time focusing on, we'll write the mortgage even when we don't have comps for those for neighbors. So I know we've helped in declining markets. I just keep coming back to one of the points that's also, what is driving the renovation, or what is driving, some of it is real repair or real need to upgrade to something that is more climate friendly. And here again, I think often it's a cost issue, and where are you finding sources for this? And I think here again, I think being with a lender who's on your side for the long haul matters. And that's again where the kind of work you led at HomeWise matters. So you're giving more. This is why it is important to expand the kind of capital that's in lenders who are on your side, so that at this part of the market in particular, if you can pay what the market bears, and if you're in a big community that's an upsurge, it's different. But many will need lenders who are on their side for these kind of repairs and upgrades. And that's where I think the CDFIs have a particular role to play.
And one of those things with CDFIs is that, as you know, that part of being a CDFI is that you don't only provide a loan, you also provide what they call development services. So help. And we had a question from Minneapolis related to this. It's like, please discuss the importance of providing financial support for organizations that provide in-depth financial preparation and homebuyer education for first time, and especially for first generation households who want to become homeowners. This is a critical resource that is often overlooked as an important step in helping households decide whether they want to be homeowners and to make sure that they can sustain homeownership when they achieve it. So Noel, do you have thoughts on the importance of those kinds of services?
Not to be glib, but I see that our time is running short, and I'll just say yes. I mean, it's so fundamentally true, the importance of culturally and linguistically relevant support, whether it's housing counseling or go down the list of a variety of things. Like, no question, it makes the transaction better.
Right. Now that's good. And the way I like to put it is, it's not, typically this is not a loan product problem, it's a systems problem. And we need a delivery system that is comprehensive and addresses the barriers so that people can be successful homeowners over the long haul. So with that, I'd like to hand it back to Monique, who's going to introduce the special guest from the U.S. Senate.
Thank you so much, Mike. So as we close the session, I want to thank everyone very much for attending. We'd like to share this short message with you from Senator Brown, the chairman of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, one of the key leaders working on this issue right now today. As we've discussed today, evidence shows the need to address affordable housing and America's growing wealth gap, and that those things are not mutually exclusive and in fact are linked. And both items are on the agenda of policymakers in Washington. As you will hear from the senator, there is growing recognition among policymakers that the affordable housing agenda needs to include ways to increase access to homeownership. There's an opportunity for the federal government to focus on that challenge this year, and Senator Brown and his committee will be at the center of forming a policy framework that will create, in his words, a new generation of homeowners. Here is that message.
I'm Shara Brown, Chairman of the Housing, Banking, and Urban Affairs Committee. Thank you for participating in this important conversation today about one of the single most important issues of our day, that's affordable housing. For too long, people in Washington have referred to our committee as the Banking Committee. The committee's work was all about Wall Street, not really what matters in people's lives, little about housing, and not almost nothing about affording a decent apartment or owning your own home. We're changing that this year. In the first months since I became chair of this committee, we held the first hearing ever on the legacy of racial discrimination in housing, from black codes to Jim Crow to redlining to the Trump administration locking in discriminatory housing practices. We held the first hearing in nearly a decade on the state of housing in America. We held a hearing with Secretary Fund to housing. Now we need to get to work during reconciliation to make affordable home ownership more accessible, including, especially for communities of color, denied that opportunity for so very, very long, for our nation, for the entirety of our nation's history. You know the statistics, the number of lower income homeowners has continued to shrink. Most concerning of all, the black home ownership rate is as low as it was when housing discrimination was legal. Think about that. 1968, finally, after passing civil rights and voting rights 3, 4, 5 years earlier, Congress finally, after Dr. King's assassination, passed fair housing. And almost as soon as it was set up, Mitt Romney's father, Governor Romney of Michigan, was nominated by President Nixon to be the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And Secretary Romney wanted to move on fair housing. President Nixon instead pursued his Southern strategy, and we've, in a sense, never recovered in terms of fair housing. That's why our work today is so very, very important. Through the next round of infrastructure funding, we have an opportunity to make transformational investments in our nation's housing and open up new opportunities for affordable home ownership. We can provide targeted down payment assistance. We can invest in lower cost houses that need repairs. We can make homes more efficient and help homeowners save on utilities. We can create a new generation of homeowners. It will take all of us. It will take housing programs, local organizations, the CDFIs, all working together to make this a reality in people's lives. Together, and this is an opportunity we may not have again to the same degree. We can make the American dream of home ownership, of keys in your pocket in the home you'll pass on to your children and your grandchildren. We can make that dream attainable for all American families. Thank you for the work that you at the Urban Institute and all of you on this call, thank you for the work you're doing to make affordable home ownership a reality for American families. Best wishes to all of you.
Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for doing a great job today and everybody for joining. I also like to thank the Urban Institute staff for their terrific work on this. You guys are rock stars. Please don't forget to do the survey. We'd love to hear what you're thinking and your reactions to all of this. The recording of this and the slides will all be on the event page at Urban Institute. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much. Bye.